The last train to Black Hollow. The train pulled into the station at exactly 11:59 p.m., just as the schedule said it would. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few late-night travelers huddled against the cold. I checked my phone. No service. Typical. I climbed aboard, finding a seat near the window. The interior was dimly lit, the kind of artificial glow that made everything feel a little off. The train smelled of metal and old upholstery, and there was a faint rattling sound, like something loose in the walls. I was heading to Black Hollow, a town so small it barely appeared on maps. My grandmother had passed, and I had to clear out her house. It wasn't a place I had visited often, but I knew it well enough to remember its eerie silence, the dense forest pressing in from all sides. The train jolted forward, rolling out of the station and into the darkness. Outside, the world blurred into blackness, trees and hills flashing by under the pale glow of the moon. The car was mostly empty except for a few scattered passengers. An older man with a worn-out hat sat near the front, staring straight ahead. A woman with her head down clutched a small bag tightly. Then there was the conductor. He moved through the aisle methodically, his uniform crisp but outdated, like something from the early 1900s. His eyes were hollow, sunken deep into his pale face. When he reached me, he didn't speak at first, just held out a gloved hand. I fumbled in my pocket for my ticket and handed it over. He studied it too long, then, in a slow, deliberate voice, said, "You shouldn't be here." I blinked. "What?" He punched the ticket without answering and moved on. I tried to shake the unease settling in my gut. Maybe he was just a weird guy. But as the train rumbled forward, I started noticing other things. The overhead lights flickered erratically, and the temperature seemed to drop. My breath fogged the glass. Outside, the landscape looked wrong. The trees weren't just shadows, they were twisting, writhing things, their branches clawing at the sky. The moon seemed closer than it should be, swollen and red like an open wound. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, trying to focus. That's when I saw them, figures standing between the trees. At first, I thought they were people, travelers lost in the woods. But they weren't moving, just standing, watching. Their faces were featureless, pale ovals in the dark. I tore my gaze away, heart pounding. The train gave a violent lurch, nearly throwing me from my seat. The old man at the front didn't react, neither did the woman with the bag. The whole car felt wrong, like I was sitting in a photograph, perfectly still while something unseen moved just beyond my vision. The conductor passed by again, his expression even grimmer than before. He stopped in front of me, leaning down just enough to whisper, "This train doesn't stop for the living." My stomach dropped. What the hell does that mean? But he was already moving away. I turned to the woman nearby. "Did you hear that?" She slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, too pale. Her eyes were gone, just dark, empty sockets. I scrambled backward in my seat, my pulse hammering. The old man turned next, his mouth stretched into a too-wide grin, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. The train shook violently. The walls groaned. Outside, the figures in the trees were closer, so close I could see their hands pressed against the glass. A shadow passed through the aisle, something tall, wrong, its limbs bending in unnatural ways. My breath caught as I felt it brush against me, impossibly cold. I had to get off this train. I bolted up, stumbling toward the nearest exit. The windows were pitch black now, showing no sign of the outside world. The doors at the end of the car wouldn't budge. Then the whispering started. Voices all around me, overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. The sound crawled under my skin, writhing like worms in my ears. The conductor appeared again, but this time he wasn't alone. Shapes loomed behind him, half-formed things, their faces stretching and twisting like melted wax. "You were never meant to leave." The train screeched, and I felt the floor vanish beneath me. I was falling. No, the train was falling. The windows shattered and darkness rushed in, swallowing everything. The last thing I heard was the whistle of the train, shrill and endless, as it disappeared into the abyss. Then silence. The last train home. I was never one to believe in ghost stories, but that changed the night I took the last train home. It was late, past midnight, and I had just finished a shift at the bar where I worked. The subway station was nearly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering like they were struggling to stay awake. The only sound was the occasional scuttle of a rat along the tracks and the distant hum of an approaching train. I checked the schedule. The last train of the night would be arriving in a few minutes. I sighed, adjusting my bag on my shoulder. There was something about the stillness of the station that made me uneasy. Maybe it was just exhaustion, or maybe it was the way the air felt heavier than usual. When the train finally arrived, its brakes screeched painfully against the rails, echoing through the empty station. The doors slid open, revealing a dimly lit interior. I stepped inside, and as soon as I did, the doors snapped shut behind me with a force that made me jump. I glanced around. The car was empty, or so I thought. As I took my seat near the middle, I noticed someone sitting at the far end of the car. A man. He wore a long, tattered coat, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He sat unnaturally still, his head slightly tilted downward. Something about him made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the way he didn't move, not even a slight shift in posture as the train lurched forward. I looked away, staring out the window, but all I could see was darkness, my own reflection staring back at me. Minutes passed. The train sped through the tunnels, but something was off. I had taken this route 1,000 times before, yet I didn't recognize the stops flashing across the screen. In fact, there were no stops. Just a blank screen where the station names should have been. I frowned. That wasn't right. I turned my gaze back toward the man at the end of the car. He was closer now. I hadn't heard him move. I hadn't seen him move, but he was now sitting only a few rows away from me, his head still tilted downward. My throat tightened. Maybe he had just switched seats while I wasn't looking. Maybe I was imagining things. But when I blinked, he was closer. I shot to my feet, gripping the pole beside me. My pulse pounded in my ears. The train rocked slightly, the overhead lights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. I didn't want to look at him. I shouldn't look at him. But I did, and I saw his face, or rather, the lack of one. Where his features should have been, there was nothing. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over bone. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Yet I could hear breathing, heavy, rasping breathing, and it wasn't coming from me. The train suddenly screeched to a halt, throwing me forward. I caught myself on one of the poles, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The doors didn't open. The outside world was still pitch black. The air had changed. It was colder now. Wrong. I turned back, and he was standing right in front of me. A shudder ran down my spine, his faceless head tilted slightly, as if he was studying me. Then, slowly, he lifted one hand, bony fingers reaching toward my face. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen, trapped under the weight of his unseen gaze. Then, in a whisper that seemed to slither through the air, I heard it. "You shouldn't be here." And the lights went out. The train jolted forward violently, and I was thrown to the floor. My head hit the metal with a sickening crack, and for a moment, everything spun. When I blinked my eyes open, the lights had returned. The train was still moving, but the man was gone. I scrambled to my feet, heart hammering. My reflection in the window was pale, shaken. I glanced around. The train was still empty. Had I imagined it? A hallucination from exhaustion? The intercom crackled to life. Next stop, Terminus. My stomach dropped. There was no terminus station on this route. I ran to the doors, frantically pressing the emergency button. Nothing happened. The train kept moving faster and faster. The windows began to change. No longer just darkness. There were shapes now, twisted figures pressing against the glass, their mouths stretched wide in silent screams. Their hands clawed at the window, their hollow eyes locked onto mine. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. The train began to slow. I turned toward the doors, bracing myself. Wherever this was, I needed to run. The train screeched to a stop. The doors slid open. A wave of cold air washed over me, and I stepped out onto the platform. Or at least, what should have been a platform. Instead, I found myself standing in an endless void, a vast nothingness stretching in every direction. The air was thick, suffocating. Shadows moved within the darkness, whispering, waiting. Behind me, the train doors shut. I spun around just in time to see it. The midnight train. I should have taken the bus. I knew it the second I stepped onto that damn train. It was nearly midnight and the station was deserted. The fluorescent lights flickered, buzzing like trapped insects. The schedule board said my train was on time, but something about the air felt off. Too still, too heavy, like the world was holding its breath. When the train finally screeched into the station, it was almost empty. Just a few passengers scattered through the dimly lit cars, their faces obscured by shadows. I found an empty seat near the back and settled in, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. The doors hissed shut. The train lurched forward. At first, everything seemed normal. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels, the faint hum of the lights, the occasional cough from another passenger. I pulled out my phone, but there was no signal, just an empty gray void where my bars should be. I glanced out the window, expecting to see the city lights flashing by. But there was nothing, just blackness. Not the kind of darkness you get in tunnels or between stations. This was something else. A void so complete it felt like the world had been erased. No buildings, no streetlights, nothing but an endless abyss stretching out in every direction. My stomach twisted. I turned to the man sitting across the aisle, a middle-aged guy in a suit. "Hey," I said, forcing a chuckle. "Do you know where we are?" He didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even breathe. A chill crawled up my neck. I waved a hand in front of his face. Nothing. His eyes were open, staring straight ahead, glassy and vacant. I swallowed hard and turned to the other passengers. A woman 2 rows up sat rigid in her seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her mouth slightly open as if she were about to speak. But she never did. A teenage boy slouched near the doors, earbuds in, eyes unfocused, all of them frozen. I shot out of my seat, heart hammering. "Hello," my voice echoed through the car. No response, no movement. It was like I was trapped in a train full of mannequins. Then the lights flickered, and they started to move. Not all at once, just small twitches at first, a finger jerking, a head tilting, a mouth stretching into something that wasn't quite a smile. The man in the suit turned his head toward me, his neck cracking like dry twigs. The woman's lips pulled back into a grin too wide, too unnatural. The boy's hand shot out, fingers twitching, grasping for something unseen. I stumbled backward, my pulse a frantic drumbeat in my ears. The train shuddered, the lights dimming until the only illumination came from the eerie glow of their wide, staring eyes. The doors wouldn't open. The emergency brake did nothing. I pounded on the windows, but the glass felt thick, unbreakable. Then they stood up. All of them. At once. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, like marionettes on tangled strings. The man in the suit took a step forward, his mouth stretching open in a silent scream. The woman's neck snapped to the side, her eyes locked onto mine. I bolted. I ran through the cars, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Every car was the same. More frozen passengers, more empty stares, more bodies twitching to life as I passed. The train kept going. No stops, no conductor, no end. Then, ahead of me, a figure. A man dressed in an old-fashioned conductor's uniform, his cap tilted just so. He stood at the far end of the car, waiting. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his eyes on me. "Where do you think you're going?" His voice was smooth, almost amused. I skidded to a halt, my chest heaving. "What is this? What's happening?" He tilted his head. "You boarded the train, didn't you?" I shook my head. I just wanted to get home." He sighed, almost sympathetically. "This train doesn't go home." The lights flickered again. The passengers were closer now, their twisted grins inches away. Cold fingers brushed my arm. I screamed. And then, nothing. I woke up in an empty train car. The lights were normal. The passengers were gone.